Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Session 2, Making Archives More Accessible, Integrating Digital Collections and Education Initiatives at the Delaware Historical Society. Merrick wishes to thank Lucidia, the sponsor of this session. Lucidia offers knowledge management, integrated library systems, and collection management software solutions to help you and your organization redefine how your knowledge is shared. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We'll be utilizing the live transcript for the session for accessibility purposes. If you would like to hide the subtitles, simply click the live transcription button at the bottom of your application and then select hide subtitle. And if your Zoom application is not maximized, you may need to click on the three dots or the more icon to turn off those subtitles. Please use the Q&A feature to pose questions to the panel, and I'll be relaying those questions to the panel at the close of the session. Finally, please remember to visit the Merrick YouTube page for our pre-recorded poster sessions and virtual tours at the link that's going in the chat. Housekeeping over, let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everybody. My name is Lee Reifenberg, and I'm the Chief Curator and Director of the Research Library and Archives at the Delaware Historical Society. I'm pleased to be moderating today's session and talking about all things related to digital asset management and illustrating how we've used our dams to support and integrate with other initiatives across our organization. It's certainly been quite a journey for us. None of it came easily. And to take us through that process, I'm joined by three of my colleagues and closest collaborators at the Delaware Historical Society. I'm going to introduce them in just a minute, but first I wanted to give you some general background about DHS and who we are as an organization. The Delaware Historical Society was founded in 1864, and we've been a collecting institution ever since that time. We're the Historical Society for the state of Delaware, but we are not a state-run agency, so we're strictly nonprofit. We own and operate 9 historic buildings, including the Delaware History Museum, which includes the Mitchell Center for African American Heritage. We also own Old Town Hall, the George Reed House and Gardens, and of course our research library and archives, among others. Our collections really run the gamut, and they include everything you can think of, from photographs, manuscripts, newspapers, maps, business and organizational records, ephemera, rare books, and a growing collection of African Americana, all with a distinctly every person Delaware focus. So we have plenty of well-known Delaware names that are represented, but we do focus on highlighting the names and stories of Delawareans who would otherwise remain unknown if not for the items they left behind. So we acknowledge and continue to address the same archival gaps and silences that so many of you struggle with, but we're very proud of the depth and breadth of our collections overall. These collections now number over 3 million items stored between our museum and library and archives, but of our roughly 20 full-time staff, we only have 4 in our collections department to care for them. So I'll let you do the math, and I know that's calculus that many of you are very familiar with. And finally, it's important to note for purposes of today's conversation that DHS does not have any in-house IT staff or any staff who are solely dedicated to digitization work. And you'll start to see how that factors in as we talk further. So what you're going to hear today is not just the nuts and bolts of how we built our digital asset management system. You're going to discover how we've been integrating it into our broader strategic goals and measuring its impact as we've identified and balanced multiple uses of the dams. First, as a public-facing research and access tool, and second, as a resource to encourage collaboration and to better support the work of other departments within our organization. So today's story is ultimately about a problem, a pandemic, because, why not? Archivists always need a little something extra to keep us on our toes, and a solution, which is the building of the dams itself. But it's also about 2 initiatives that we're developing and running on parallel tracks that eventually crash together in an unexpected, but ultimately productive and very impactful way. And finally, it's about what we've learned from that journey and the data that doesn't lie and where we're going to go from here. So it's fair to say that it was ultimately a global pandemic that lent a whole new sense of urgency and underscored DHS's need to meet public demand for digital collections access. We all know that the need for access to archival collections doesn't diminish just because in-person visits to a repository are restricted, but the issue of digital access goes back much further in our organization's history. And that's largely due to a series of interconnected challenges that created something of a domino effect for us. First of all, our collections department lacked the infrastructure and the equipment and a formal, sustainable mechanism to store and share digitized materials requested by our patrons and staff. That was a big one. And this was compounded by the fact that in the early days of our tenure in the collections department, my colleagues and I inherited a whole interesting set of situations, and I'm being diplomatic. Among them was that the process for locating digital assets and fulfilling digital image requests was about as antiquated and inefficient as it could possibly be. Images were scattered on a variety of network drives. Many of them were unidentified or lacked even basic usable metadata, and some of them weren't even images that we owned. So from an archival and public service perspective, that was a complete nightmare. Despite our best efforts, this also had a significant impact on staff from other departments who relied on digital collections for their work and were then limited in their capacity to complete projects. This was particularly true for our education department, as you'll see. And finally, as DHS adopted an increasingly digital-first approach to our work as the pandemic wore on, demand for digital assets, both internally and on the public side, continued to outpace our capacity to provide them. So it was really at that point that we knew something had to give, and DHS would have to commit to making digitization a strategic priority. Now, luckily, despite the pandemic, or perhaps because of it, we were able to take advantage of some opportunities to solve these problems and build a DAMS that is now the basis for a scalable, sustainable digitization program at DHS. Bill Robinson, our preservation librarian, who has spearheaded the project and is now the primary manager of our digitization efforts, is going to be up next to tell you all about that. And then Rebecca Fay, our director of education, will join us to tell you about Liberty in Our Grasp, the second parallel initiative that I referred to earlier. The confluence of these two projects really helped us to dig deeper and think more holistically about how our DAMs could be used to reach new audiences, including teachers and students, and support the work of our staff on projects and initiatives across our organization. And finally, you're going to hear from Kristen Geiger-Reka, our Web and Digital Projects Manager and a key member of our DAMs team, to talk about what we've learned and how we've been measuring the impact of our DAMs and its associated initiatives now that we're more than a year out from the initial launch of our platform. So when our panelists finish, we're going to come back together at the end for a lightning round of takeaways and lessons learned, and then we'd love to invite you to join the conversation and ask questions. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bill to talk about our journey to build the DAMs itself.
Thank you, Lee. Bill Robinson, I'm the preservation librarian at DHS. I wanted to talk a little bit first about the state of our digital collections at DHS in 2020. First of all, since 2009, we had produced about 200 gigs of digital files. These were produced through ad hoc requests from the public and from the staff for things like educational initiatives, public publications, exhibits, social media campaigns, etc. We stored all these files on an external USB drive and backed it up to a second USB drive. And it was always our intention to make sure that data on both those drives always matched up, but that wasn't always the case in the end. For some of the collections on the USB drive, we had corresponding item level metadata, which already existed on our online archives catalog. But for others, the only descriptive metadata that we had was in file names on the USB drive. As far as access goes, Lee, our chief curator, was the only person that had direct access to the drive. There wasn't any public or staff access. As we distributed files to staff, copies of the files were scattered across various network drives, which later caused storage and discovery problems. And we delivered files to the public by sharing service, like Dropbox. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. So on top of all these problems with digital access back in 2020, we were trying to new ways to reach our audiences virtually during the pandemic. And this is when we heard about the JP Morgan Chase Force for Good program. And in their words, Force for Good connects JP Morgan Chase technologists with non-profit institutions to build sustainable technology solutions to help achieve their missions. So when we heard about this, we thought that the development of the DAMs might be a good candidate for this program. And Force for Good technologists typically meet, can you go back one? Typically meet weekly with a nonprofit client. Okay. To discuss end user requirements, evaluate and choose a solution develop and demo the solution, and create a handover plan so that the nonprofit can maintain the solution going forward. So in their words, this roughly corresponds to 4 phases of discover, define, develop, and deliver. Next slide, please. So for DHS, this collaboration with the Force for Good program fell into 2 phases. During the first phase from September 2020 to March 2021, DHS applied to the program with the idea of developing a dams, and we were accepted into the program. And then we met with Force for Good weekly, discussed requirements for dams, and we evaluated several solutions and chose a vendor. We ended up choosing Islandora as a solution, and as a vendor, we went with Discovery Garden with their Islandora 8 SAT solution. We then brought that solution to our executive board at DHS for approval, and we signed off with Discovery Garden for the solution in March of 2021. Next slide, please. In the second phase from April through August of 2021, we worked with Discovery Garden to implement the system. And Force for Good team also developed and tested what they called a matching tool, which would later help us migrate items from the USB drive into the dams. So after we signed off with Discovery Garden, Force for Good had not only helped us choose a solution, but they stayed on in the project to act as a sort of tech advocate in our conversations with Discovery Garden. And they developed this matching tool, which would be very, very helpful in getting us started in ingesting items into the dams and maintaining momentum for the project. Next slide, please. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the matching tool and how it worked. The matching tool was developed in Python to basically match items on that USB external drive where all of our files were to descriptive metadata in our online archives catalog. And it worked with 2 files. The first was the file directory of the USB drive that was printed to a text document using Karen's print directory. And the second file was a CSV export of all the descriptive data in our archives catalog. So basically what the matching tool does is match IDs in file names on the USB drive to local identifiers at the item level in that catalog CSV. And then finally puts all that associated data from our archives catalog into a CSV ingest that was designed by Discovery Garden for use in Islandora 8. Next slide, please. So this is basically what that first file looks like. It's a text export of file directory. And you'll see, for example, this folder right here in the middle of the HP Canon and Son photograph collection. And then over there on the right, there's several files with these 1998.69 local identifiers, which would have been matched to local identifiers in the CSV export of the archives catalog. Next slide, please. And this is the export from our archives catalog. You can see in column F there's a column for identifying number. It's a little cut off. So the local identifiers from the USB drive would have been matched either to that identifying number at the item level or to an accession number in the archives catalog at the item level. And this is where all the other descriptive data after that, those local identifiers were matched would have been drawn into the CSV ingest that Discovery Garden designed. Next slide, please. So I'll just go through some screenshots really quickly to show you how the matching tool works. This is on the left here is what it looks like when you open it up. On the right is where we choose those 2 files that I was talking about. You'll see the external drive directory up there on the top has been chosen, and on the bottom, the export of our archival records. Then we would click on that Analyze button in that box there on the right. And next slide, please. Then we would have this window on the left where we would choose one or more collections to analyze. You can see there I've checked off the HP Canon Sun photograph collection. And then we would click on the select button in that box. And then this window on the right would appear where we were able to define fields for items across a collection. So for example, for everything in the HP Canon Sun's photograph collection, you could clean up the file name to make sure it matched, clean up the collection name to make sure it matched the collection title in the archives catalog. You could give the same content type, resource type, genre, and rights data to each item across the collection. And then we click on the Done button on the bottom right in that box, and you can change the slide, please. And then it would create this spreadsheet ingest, which was designed by Discovery Garden for Islandora 8. So right here in the middle, you can see in column J, there's that local identifier that would have been matched with this collection. In column D, there's also a digital file location where we would stage the files for ingest into Islandora 8. And then in all the other columns, you can see all this other data, descriptive data that would have been pulled in from that CSV export from the catalog. So for example, there's subjects, there's titles, organizations, genre, etc. So after a bit of cleanup, we would have been able to ingest this spreadsheet into Islandora 8. Next slide. So in August of 2021, Force for Good left us, the project ended. And since then, we were able to use that matching tool to create several spreadsheet ingests. And initially using that method, we got about 800 or 900 items into the dams, which was extremely helpful. We also finalized our hardware and storage setup and wrote some workflow documentation and selection and prioritization guidelines, which has been very helpful with interns and part-time staff. And finally, in February of 2022, we launched the dams, and we now have over 1,800 items in digital collections, and you can visit digital collections at digital.dehistory.org. So that's a basic overview of our project with Force for Good and Discovery Garden and the establishment of our dams. During that whole time with Force for Good and Discovery Garden, we were also trying to reach out to our audiences with educational initiatives and getting them access to digital primary sources. So this was really exciting and challenging at the time because we were also trying to get this dams implemented. And I will turn it over to Rebecca Fay to talk a little bit about those educational initiatives.
Thanks, Bill. So Rebecca Fay here. I am the Director of Education at the Delaware Historical Society. And when I started in 2015, I pretty much started on the same exact day as Lee. She mentioned some antiquated and inefficient processes being inherited by the collections department. That was also true of education. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but I want to explain my role at the Historical Society. So I focus on creating and providing resources to Delaware educators and students. And this can take the form of field trips, whether that's virtual, on-site, or outreach, fielding teacher requests for primary sources to meet curriculum needs, creating primary source packets, lesson plans and activities, teacher workshops, public programs, and partnerships with teachers, schools, and school districts to help enhance curriculum and classroom activities. Other responsibilities include organizing and planning public programs, family and community days, as well as partnerships with community organizations and cultural and historical organizations working on projects related to museum education and programming. Next slide, please. So because of those inefficient processes that were in place when I started at the Historical Society, Prior to 2020, the main way education staff used archival material at the society was very limited. As Bill mentioned earlier, there was no public or staff access to previously scanned material, and copies of digital images were scattered across various network drives. So we could use those if they were useful. Most of the time they weren't. But we did use what was available. And you'll see why in just a minute, but we used archival materials to design promotional material for public programs. We would also conduct teacher workshops geared toward a specific collection. So the image at the right shown here is from our Minker collection. And this is a collection that was already digitized due to a prior project and grant money and displayed on our website. So this allowed us to utilize it for a teacher professional development workshop. Excuse me, next slide, please. So we also use primary sources at the Historical Society for National History Day students. They come to the library or we provide resources when requested. And education staff would use archival material in long-term side projects as well as in our field trips. I do want to note that within our field trips, unless we're talking about the very limited field trips to the library, that material was not used in any way that where we were asking students to dive deep into it. So in our regular field trips, we were just using them for illustration purposes and not for any kind of critical thinking exercises or anything like that. And while similar organizations were already providing lesson plans and resources geared toward teachers and students, we did not have the capacity to do that. And requests from individual teachers for very specific primary sources did come in. And when this happened, we either struggled to fulfill those requests as quickly as the teachers needed them, or we were unable to fulfill the request at all. Next slide, please. All right. So the main reason we only used archival material sparingly prior to 2020 was due to the crazy workflow associated with finding and accessing anything. So I'm going to quickly review my workflow. So this is what it would look like when me or somebody else in education would be looking for a digital asset. So one of the first things we would do is we would search our online catalogs and the various shared drives. Me personally, I'd go right to the shared drives because it was already digitized. It was easier to just incorporate it into the project. So usually what happened, I would find an image or a document on the shared drive, and it would be a random image with no citation. The name of the file would just be the scan number, so I wouldn't know what it was, what collection it came from, anything like that. So I would have to email Bill or Lee asking, one, is this ours? And if it is ours, can I have the information about it? Where did it come from, the collection, a citation, all of that. So if it was ours, I was able to use it to create a resource. If it wasn't, I had to start all over again, which would take me back to the beginning where I would search our online catalogs. So if I found something of interest in our catalog, I would then email Lee or Bill, ask them to pull the collection. I would search the collection, request scans, and create a resource. If I found nothing in the catalog, which did happen often, and that could be either user error or just not really paying attention to what I was doing, I would email Lee or Bill and say, do you have anything related to this topic? And if they did, they would either already have something saved on those external hard drives that they could share with me. And if that worked with my project, I would use it. If it didn't work with my project, I would start again, or they didn't have anything. So this was a continual process. And it was like going from A to B to C all the way back to A again, over and over again. So while it was easy to be patient, understanding the constraints that the collection staff were under and understand their usual way of doing things, it wasn't anything that we were just used to it. This is how things work. That all changed in early 2020. Next slide, please. In February of 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in a racially motivated attack. And immediately after this became national news, requests from teachers dramatically increased. Teachers were asking for any primary sources or other material that could help them contextualize racism and white supremacy in Delaware and in the United States for their students. So I shared what I could and began the tedious process of looking for more in our collections. Next slide, please. So I knew that we already had about 38 advertisements related to enslavement already scanned, saved to a shared drive, And I was able to share those with teachers. I had already been using them for a long-term education project. And so I uploaded them to a Google Drive for the teachers, along with some sample activities and instructions for how they could be used for any teacher who asks. But teachers were asking for more. This wasn't just what they wanted. They needed more information. They needed more resources. So next slide, please. In June of 2020, I began doing some research to see how other similar organizations were sharing primary sources. And I knew that DHS had the resources that teachers needed beyond those advertisements, but I just had to figure out where they were and how to get those resources to teachers in a useful way. So many historical societies and museums were offering primary source sets, databases of primary sources related to African-American history, and lessons and activities. And one resource I stumbled upon was Freedom on the Move. And Freedom on the Move is a project out of Cornell University. And Cornell partnered with institutions along the East Coast to compile and make accessible advertisements related to slavery. So they also partnered with the Hard History Project to have teachers design lesson plans utilizing the Freedom on the Move database resources. So I was really intrigued by this method, and I immediately contacted the Hard History Project to learn more about their work with Cornell and to see if they were interested in working with DHS to create something similar, but with a Delaware focus and utilizing more than just those advertisements. So we plan to start with the topic of enslavement as phase 1 of the project, with the idea that the following phases would move through history as close to the present as we could go, based on the archival material available in our collections. Next slide, please. So Liberty in Our Grasp was born out of those conversations with the Hard History Project. And the purpose of Liberty in Our Grasp was to contract with teachers in Delaware to design lesson plans and activities utilizing DHS's archival material available in our slavery collection, not just the advertisements. The other purpose was to help collections and access by providing the staff that could digitize and create metadata for the slavery collection. So education and Mitchell Center staff collaborated to draft a program proposal that could be used to apply for grant funding. And in November of 2021, our then executive director shared our idea with Delaware's Secretary of State. And I'm sorry, that's actually November of 2020. I apologize. With the Delaware Secretary of State, and he promised funding on the spot. And 1 month later, the money was in the bank. So this was really great. And it was a pleasant surprise, but we actually hadn't had the time to bring Bill and Lee in on the idea and get their approval. So now we had to bring them up to speed ASAP and let them know that this project now had to happen starting now. Next slide, please. So we began to draft the project materials, a timeline, intern job postings, training materials. And in April of 2021, we hired and trained 2 interns. So they were trained by collection staff, education staff, and Mitchell Center staff. And under the supervision of collections, the interns searched DHS's collections catalogs, scanned and created metadata, and the scans were saved to a Dropbox to share with teachers working on the project. And this all happened between May and June of 2021. So in May, also teachers were selected by the Hard History Project and education staff through an application and interview process. Next slide, please. In June of 2021, the teachers were trained by Education, Mitchell Center, and the Hard History Project on best practices for teaching about slavery. And then teachers were also given access to the Dropbox of scanned collection materials that the interns had been compiling. And also in June of 2021, we got lucky. Delaware's Governor Carney signed House Bill 198 into law. And House Bill 198 required the teaching of Black history for students in grades K to 12 for all public and charter schools. So we knew that what we were doing, we were on the right track. We knew that these lesson plans would be in demand. So in July, from July through September of 2021, teachers started lesson plans. They were then peer reviewed with other teachers in the cohort. They were staff reviewed and they were expert reviewed. And then in November of 2021, the lessons were approved, edited, and also field tested in the classrooms. And once finished, they were sent to our graphic designer. And the official launch for Liberty in Our Grasp was scheduled for February of 2022. Next slide, please. And then that's where everything came to kind of a screeching halt. as we were reviewing the lessons and getting them ready to turn over to Kristen, our digital initiatives and projects manager, we realized that the lesson plans, the links for the primary sources were linking to the Dropbox. And they were not in those archival material was not in the digital collections yet. And we wanted those lesson plans that would be on our website to link directly to digital collections and hope that teachers using the lesson plans would then also explore more and see what else we had on offer. So I thought that all of the archival materials scanned by the interns would be available in the DAMs, and I was wrong. So Bill and I talked, we sorted it out, but he had to fit getting all of that material that the teachers used into his already existing workflow. So, one thing that hasn't really been mentioned is that while all of these two projects were going on, we had other projects as well. We were in the middle of, a shutdown for the pandemic and all of that. And then Bill had to send me the links, and I had to then go back and edit the lesson plan so the primary source images linked directly to their pages on the DAMs. And it took time, but we were finally able to turn everything over to our web and digital initiatives manager, Kristen, and the project officially launched in October of 2022.
Hello, everyone. First, I just want to draw your attention to the links I just put in the chat, one for Liberating Our Grass project on our website, and also the link to the digital collections website. But thank you, Rebecca. I'm Kristen, and I'm part of the project team with Lee and Bill, supporting them during the development process of the DAMs. And at present, as a manager of DHS's web spaces, I continue to work with them growing and maintaining the digital collections website and thinking with them about the public-facing front-end elements of interaction. And I work with Rebecca on education initiatives, such as Liberty in Our Grasp, using the DAMs and all of our web spaces. I am also thinking about data, specifically digital engagement data that tells us the who through how about visitation to and activity on the website. What I'm going to talk about here is impact. Impact in the ways we define it in terms of digital engagement, like using quantitative data such as number of users, but also in non-countable ways in which the site has made an impact. On DHS as an organization, for example, staff now have more ready access to resources they can use in programs, presentations, and more. Everything my colleagues have said so far touches on impact of the digital collections website, and the way this project came together was very much driven by our thoughts individually and collectively about the potential impact. Our digital collections website has become an increasingly important tool for research, education, and public access to our collections, making the impact strategy and our methods for measuring impact all the more important. There are many ways to define, track, and measure impact, and there's no one size fits all strategy, but there are two crucial aspects. One, impact strategy should be scalable, and two, should consider more than one type of data. From the very beginning of the conceptual phase through development and now, we were, have been, and are considering impact, such as what problems we want to solve, what goals we want to achieve, how we will know that we have solved problems, how we will know we have achieved our goals, and how can we use what we've learned to advance our impact strategy. Having an impact strategy from the start is what helped us make the initial case for this project and align it to our mission, vision, values, and organizational strategic priorities. The first phase of this strategy took place pre-development and involved department interviews and a survey to help us determine the problems and goals. The second phase is ongoing, but it's tracking analytics and monitoring performance, engaging impact numerically. And the third phase, which is also ongoing, began concurrently with the second, and it looks at the non-numeric evidence to determine performance value and potential areas for growth. Information from all of those phases affect our impact strategy and helps us optimize the digital collections website. Next slide, please. Before the project officially began, we on the project team conducted a survey to assess staff experience accessing DHS's resources and to help us understand how a digital collections platform could resolve issues of accessibility and to identify problems and brainstorm solutions so we could get an idea of how a digital collections platform would impact our work and our ability to serve. The survey results confirmed what we more or less expected to be true, that the process for requesting images and scans, while generally considered efficient, could be improved, and that access to resources is important to staff work. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1/3 of staff respondents rated the current process, as of 2021, for requesting images and scans efficient, but 50% found it mostly or somewhat efficient. Rebecca spoke to the wonky workflow a little bit ago, so you have an idea about the inefficiency of this process. It worked for what it was, but overall was less than an ideal system. When asked in single words or short phrases to list reasons for their above rating, staff responded saying they either get what they need and the process is efficient, or they refrain from requesting and settle for what they can get on the shared drives, or they don't request or access collections at all. Staff experience varied with the process for requesting images and scans, depending on need, but there was definitely a sense that inefficiency in the process held staff back from making requests. When asked if they believed they would use the digital collections platform for doing their work, 85% of respondents agreed, which is significant because in the same survey, only about 25% of respondents claimed to make image requests on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, yet 85% said that they would use it. Within recent years, DHS has implemented a digital-first strategy, of which the digital collections website's launch was a significant advancement. And one of the reasons why DHS implemented this strategy was to meet this need for digital access. We already knew we wanted to implement a DAM system for obvious reasons, but the purpose of the survey wasn't to measure or secure buy-in. Rather, it was to determine what the impact could be for the platform. The surveys gave us data by which to measure impact, and we also met with departments across our organization to further understand staff needs and how the digital collections platform would meet those needs. Next slide, please. At the time of the launch of digital.dehistory.org, DHS had two primary websites, dehistory.org, our main website, and readhouseandgardens.org, the website for our campus in Newcastle, and two project websites. Total annual visitation to our websites accumulated across those websites was around 30 to 46,000 until the launch of the digital collections website. Since its launch in February to the end of 2022, digital.dehistory.org had 3,800 users, which put our total web users over 50,000 for 2022. To date, digital.dehistory.org has had over 5,000 users. Growth is a good metric of success and impact, but it's not the only measure. Consistency is another measure, and we've been able to sustain that growth. Upon its launch in February and over the next couple of months, the website saw over 500 users each month. On average, the website had about 300 users per month in 2022, and in the first quarter of 2023, it averaged over 500 users. So we are still at the stage of our impact strategy where we do want to see more growth, but averaging 500 users per month was an accomplishment. From February through 2022, 60% of our users came via a direct link referred either by the DHS website or wherever there's a direct link to the DAMs. 20% came from Google and 5% from Facebook. All DHS web spaces and social profiles are cross-linked to ensure traffic is shared amongst sites, and this demonstrates the success of traffic sharing. We can also see that a high number of users come from Google, and a Google Search Console report tells us that the search query with the highest click to impression ratio is Wilmington dry goods, a well-remembered former retail on Market Street near the Delaware Historical Society's present-day Wilmington location. Nostalgia is a powerful connection to the site for our users. Not only did we grow digitally with the launch of our digital collections website and increased access to more of our resources, we've also demonstrated connectivity among all of our websites, platforms, and profiles that unify our digital presence as our digital footprint. Next slide, please. The digital collections website continues to have about 400 to 500 users per month. Any user to the website has access to all 1,200 items, many of which are available for download, with more being added on a recurring basis. According to the survey conducted in 2021, staff typically would hold back from requesting scans over concerns about staff time. But now, after the launch of our digital collections website and a year out, staff have more ready access to what they might need. That said, not all issues identified with the initial survey have been resolved, of course, but it has helped resolve a lot of day-to-day work needs. For example, our graphic designer, who works really hard to make great graphics for us, can often go to the digital collection site and get what she needs in the quality that she needs. So far, a lot of what we have digitized is our frequently requested, commonly used, or of popular interest, like the Delaware photograph collection. So that at least helps free up staff time to help people get the things they need that aren't already digitized or as easily accessible. Staff also have access to more collections items as well as the metadata associated with these items, so they can use them for projects, programs, events, and more. During the survey phase, respondents said they usually find what they need in our shared drive or other communal spaces, but even so, that information, the metadata, isn't always there. Working with Rebecca, we've launched a few education projects that link users to primary sources found in the digital collections website. Liberty in Our Grasp, as Rebecca was speaking to a bit ago, is a strong example of this. Since its launch in October of 2022, Liberty in Our Grasp web pages on our website have had over 300 users, expanding the potential impact of the digital collection site by connecting those users with digitized resources. As of January 2023, DHS has spent $63 on digital advertising for the digital collections website, which is a very small amount. And that's resulted in over 13,000 impressions counted each time the Google ad is shown on a search page. 86 clicks each time the ad is clicked, and 26 conversions, which is when the user performs a specific action, and in this case, a page view. Digital advertising helps to bump reach and engagement on the digital collections website, but it doesn't account for more than 10% of visitation. So when I say DHS spent $63, I'm talking in the Google Ads platform. And in addition to that, we leverage free and low-cost tools such as Google Analytics, Google Data Studio, and using social media digital advertising tools. So on this topic of digital advertising, which I could spend a whole session on alone, really, I would want to mention that promo and marketing are key, and often for smaller organizations like ours, marketing can kind of be an afterthought. We ran several campaigns for the digital collections, including e-blasts, Google Ads, social media posts, etc. A campaign at launch we ran, and then again 6 months later, and then we ran another one during the 1-year anniversary. And all of these campaigns did bump our numbers and helped us get in front of more people, but the audience was already there. These benchmarks are our key performance indicators, and they tell us impact in terms of how we're doing and what we can do better and what we might be able to expect. So we know the website is being visited and used. We also know we could digitize more records that bring in and engage new users. And we could expect that if we digitize more records, then visitation and engagement numbers will be sustained or grow. And this is why the impact strategy has to be scalable, because where we are now is not where we'll be next year. For example, we're still building the internal infrastructure that sustains the project in the long term and allows us to digitize at a faster rate. That will inevitably change how we're measuring impact. So also, the data is what evidences this initiative as one of our strategic priorities and helps us figure out what's next. Next slide, please. Projects such as this are no small undertaking, needless to say, and it becomes really hard to report on impact if there aren't goals that give us the questions to ask of our data. Well-defined goals, actions, and desired outcomes give focus and direction. In review from our experience, an effective impact strategy will include diverse methods for measuring impact, because it's not just about user numbers, but about the experience. and other considerations. For example, we can count the number of users to our site, and that tells us something. But we've also had organizations reach out directly to us for guidance on building up their own digital collections websites and dams, and you can't really capture that in numbers. B, incorporate adaptable methods for measuring impact. Positive and negative performance will influence the process of measuring impact. So a good strategy isn't static and can and should change when you learn more information. Impact is important at the beginning, during development, post-launch, and at the end. And indefinitely, it's important at all stages. And also C, establish centralized access to digital engagement reports. We track data, or we track visitation data on a regular basis, monthly, quarterly, and annually. And this data is available to anyone at any time. So when I run reports, I'm looking at performance, but somebody else might look at these reports and get new insights from it. Next slide, please. The impact of the digital collections project can be summarized as follows. It helped us to create and share more digital resources that give us new ways to engage with our audiences. It provided an opportunity to collaborate effectively interdepartmentally and grow as a team. It helped us increase web visitation and digital engagement, and helped us maximize efficiency in our work by providing direct access to resources. Measuring impact isn't just numbers, but it's looking at all the layers of evidence and results together and what we've learned from the data and the challenges we've encountered along the way. At this point is when I turn it back to my colleagues to talk a little bit more about challenges and lessons learned, because goodness knows we experienced some challenges and learned a lot of lessons.
That's great. Bill, Rebecca, and Kristen, thank you so much. As you can see from these intersecting stories, these projects had a lot of arms that had a lot of implications across DHS. And clearly not everything went smoothly or according to plan. It rarely does for us. But we learned a lot, and we continue to learn week by week and month by month. And in fact, Bill and Kristen and I continue to meet as a DAMS team on a weekly basis to discuss issues related to the platform, our workflow, marketing and promotion, and our goals for the year. And in the coming months, we're going to be opening those discussions more often to include Rebecca and the education team, our staff in the Mitchell Center for African American Heritage, and other stakeholders who have an interest in using our assets to better serve and engage our user communities. So it's definitely going to be a conversation that involves a lot more people as time goes on. With that, I'd like to bring our panel back for a quick lightning round of challenges and takeaways and lessons learned. Remember that many of these are specific to our experience, but we are going to go through them in order to get to your questions. There may be some that resonate with you or your situation, so please feel free to ask us more about them. Bill, you had identified the first challenge, so I'm going to invite you to jump in and explain that one.
Sure, thanks, Lee. So first of all, during our project with Force for Good and the implementation of the dams with this Discovery Garden, during just our portion with Force for Good, the viability of the dams and administrative buy-in was always up in the air. Force for Good was really helpful in helping us find a solution, but we had to then go to administration here and persuade them that this was our best choice and our best way forward. It was really helpful that Force for Good at that time knew that they'd probably be able to develop that matching tool and get us started in digital collection. And have hundreds of items ready to go at launch. And that really offset a lot of the cost for staff time and resources that would have gone into entering those initial items into the dams. Rebecca, for the second challenge, she got into this already, but there was the timing of the dams implementation versus the digitization for education initiatives was also a challenge. So in the summer of 2021, we were still implementing the dams. And this was also while the interns were scanning and providing metadata for items for Liberty in our graphs. So they, at that point, we weren't quite ready to enter things into the dams manually or through spreadsheet ingest. The interns had to do it in a separate spreadsheet to start. Then I had to come back after them when the dams was ready and re-enter that into the dams, all the metadata and the digital files. So I think that really paused the project a little bit and took up some more time. The communication between our small staff and external stakeholders is also a challenge. We have a small staff as it is, so we don't always have time to communicate in the ways we'd like. There were also several external stakeholders as part of the dams project and the Liberty Under Grass project. So for instance, I wasn't always hearing things from the Hard History Project or the teachers that were involved in making lesson plans. And likewise, Rebecca wasn't hearing from us about specifics of our project with Force for Good or Discovery Garden, or at least to the extent that would have been helpful to both departments. And as far as customization goes, I'll turn that over to Kristen to discuss.
Thanks, Bill. So for customization, as Lee had spoken to earlier about not having an internal IT staff solely dedicated to this, customization was a little bit of a challenge because out of the box, the platform wasn't fully customized in the way that maybe we would like it to be. Through development, we noticed a few things about functionality that could be improved or optimized for our users, and we weren't fully able to address those for a variety of reasons, including complexity. Some customizations would be too complex for us to do on our own and thus might come with a hefty price tag. Other customizations we would be able to do on our own, but it's a matter of having a solid understanding of how the back end works. And we keep a running list of changes we would like to make eventually, either through Discovery Garden, the vendor, or on our own. And so there's definitely a learning curve with this platform. And then to the next point, I'm going to speak a little bit about it and then turn it to Rebecca. But for managing expectations, this was a big one because over the course of development, we found ourselves continually having to manage expectations of what the digital collections website would be and clarify what a DAMS even is, because even internally in our field, it's not always necessarily a term that everybody is familiar with. And so getting ready for launch, we just had to be really clear that even upon launch, we would have a lot available, but not everything in our collections. And in fact, we might never have everything in our collections and loaded up to the website, and hence why we have to come up with a priority for our workflow. So Rebecca, if you want to speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I just want to say, as Bill mentioned earlier, the communication was kind of a little disjointed, and I would say that's like across the board for both projects. And it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's easy to be patient, but you hear something's coming and you're like, oh, when's it going to be ready and what's going to be in there? So being patient and understanding. I'm not an archivist. I don't know what goes in. I'm also not a technology person, so I don't know what goes into the building of a dams. And you hear, oh, it's going to take a long time, but then months later, and you're like, well, it's been a long time. Where is everything? So that was definitely a challenge. And managing the expectations of the teachers involved in the project as well. I think they thought that they were going to have more access to more scanned materials than we were giving them. So that was a little bit difficult. And then I also want to speak a little bit to capacity. And then I think some of my other colleagues have something to say about that. But we're in the middle of a pandemic while we're doing this, and we have other projects going on. One thing we had, it was the suffrage centennial. And we had a grant funded series of programs that were started in January. And everything shut down right before our third program. It was a monthly series. And so, we were trying to figure out what to do about that and how to host those virtually. And we had other projects going on. For me, myself, I had teachers, not only did they want these resources related to African-American history, but they also needed resources. Once everything shut down, they needed resources to actually do school from home. And so we were getting a lot of pressure that way. And then in the middle of the Liberty in Our Grass project, we lost a full-time staff member who was working on the project in the Mitchell Center. So having that, capacity was definitely a challenge, and we're all working from home. So that was a little stressful. I don't know if anybody else needs to add anything to that.
No, I think you've
think
pretty
so.
well covered it, Rebecca. And, not to belabor the point, but these were really, I cannot begin to overstate how intense these two projects were. And our departments, for as much as we, think we collaborate and think we communicate, this was really a chance to sort of learn about how the other one works. And I think, as archivists, we can all appreciate that very few things enrage an archivist, digital or otherwise, more than, well, can't you just scan it? Can't you just, get it online? Because people genuinely, like Rebecca, have no idea what exactly that entails. So there was certainly some education involved for the education team, but there was also a learning curve for us as in the collections department, in terms of how teachers work, what they need, when they need it, why they need it. So it really, that kind of hyper focus from two very, very different professional perspectives, and then throwing Kristen in there with her, data magic and, all of the things that she's looking to do to measure our impact. It really forced us to learn a lot more about our respective departments and workflows, and figure out how to integrate them more effectively. So yeah, it's been a learning curve, but a good one for sure for all of us involved. And then the final thing I can speak to from a sort of more administrative perspective is this question of sustainability moving forward. For all of the reasons that we've already stated, just because we now have this wonderful dams platform doesn't change the fact that we still have no one to devote specifically to the task of digitization. And as we can all appreciate, particularly for Bill and myself, this is just one of our 400 other jobs. So it's not like, somebody is just going to go give us a new staff member to dedicate to this particular task. And yet we do have this growing demand to continue to populate the dams, but without that corresponding increase in resources. So these are things that we're constantly thinking about. We know that we need to keep this dams viable and sustainable. We've got most of the pieces to do that, but there is still very much a human element to this that can't be ignored. So that's something that we're thinking about, and it does sort of speak to, in as much as these are challenges, there are opportunities as well. And I think we're going to jump into that, some lessons and opportunities moving forward that we're thinking about.
Sure, thanks, Lee. I think we have enough time for questions, so we'll kind of go through this quickly. But
yeah.
First lesson we learned, which I think we all know, we need to learn over and over again, is that we should communicate early and often, especially during projects which might contain a certain amount of uncertainty. So for me, that really was brought home in two aspects. One was the selection and prioritization for a specific audience of teachers versus a more broad audience. After the Liberty in Our Grasp, interns had done all their scanning. I think the most interesting resources were the early documents for the Civil War that were written in cursive. And I knew that it's a challenge for students to take in that type of material, but it didn't quite dawn on me that teachers would sort of just reject out of hand anything that had cursive in it. And my thought was, maybe if we include this, the teacher will look at it, they'll be interested, and then maybe we'll have time to do a transcription. But that just wasn't the case. When they came back with their choices, it was all easily readable print material. So I initially put a bunch of cursive stuff into the dams after the project, but I had to go back and then focus on more of the print stuff. The second area where communication would have helped is, and Rebecca touched on this, was how digital assets would be delivered to teachers and by teachers in their lesson plans. I thought they would be included in the lesson plans as files or up on a website, but learned that they wanted links out to digital collections So we had to pause and put all that stuff in digital collections before we could provide those links. And we'll move on to opportunities here. There was an opportunity for language remediation and awareness, which is really important to us and a strategic goal of ours right now. The interns in Libertarian Grasp had the opportunity to provide, for example, a title for an item, but could also provide a revised item and clean up the language. Is really important because most of these documents were pre-Civil War and had some language that might have been harmful. So we could use that language to put it in digital collections, but also go back and change it in our catalog. And I will I think Rebecca talk about this next bullet point.
Yeah, absolutely. So because of these two projects and kind of getting used to working more closely with each other, it leads to other opportunities for additional education collections and digital projects collaboration. So for example, primary source sets. I've been almost since I started, I've been wanting to do primary source sets on our website, and I'm sure you all know what they are, but it's, a group of documents, some background information and some questions, and teaching students how to critically think about these primary sources. So this is, one of those things we actually have gotten started a little bit, but it's slow going. And then also the opportunity for digital exhibits or supplementary materials and activities that go along with those digital exhibits. So now that more documents and images are in the dams, I've got more that I can use to create supplementary material even for our physical exhibits. So it's a really great opportunity. And I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything about the collaborations, but
only that there are more to come, and
yeah.
I think we're all looking forward to those, and especially now that we have a better sense of how to communicate around them. And the final sort of opportunity going forward is really a companion to the sustainability issue. It's just meant that we've had to think a little more deeply about how to work within our own constraints, how to make better use perhaps of staff who don't have digitization experience. Bill very carefully, and this is an act of genius on his part, designed our workflow, our digitization workflow, so that interns and graduate assistants and part-time staff can sort of enter and exit the workflow at different places. So it does make it possible for small, discrete digitization jobs to be completed without, making this into a really sort of full-time position, although we would very much love to do that. But we are deeply dependent on it's allowed us to create new internships. It's certainly become a large component of the work that our graduate assistants do. So, we're figuring out how to make this work without corresponding staff increases. But those are all things that we're looking to do through partnerships and grants, and we're going to keep making it work as best we can. At this point, we'd really love to open the floor to your questions. Again, remember, please do enter them in the Q&A feature. And we've already got a couple coming in, and one was, and Bill and Kristen, this is probably for you. What program do you use to create the records? Is it Content DM?
For digital collections, what?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we use it's Islandora as provided by Discovery Garden. So it's I think at this point it's Islandora 9, their software as a solution product of Islandora.
How do you connect your collection finding aids with the digital collections? Do you link out to the digital collections if there are digitized items?
So at this point we are adding, we're actually adding links to our archives catalog, which is Archivera, to link to our digital collections. But I don't think at this point we have finding aids links on the other side in digital collections, but that is a step we want to take.
That is definitely a goal for sure. We really have intended our DAMs and our other online catalogs, which are hosted through Lucidia, to be sort of integrated tools that are used kind of in tandem. So that is the hope. Next question, how many lesson plans has DHS created in total? Are they for K through 12 and how are they similar or different? Can you share some of your favorites? Rebecca, that's all you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually had 6 teachers in the cohort. We had 2 from elementary school, 2 from middle school, and 2 from high school. So there were 6 lesson plans to start with. And then we had another social studies coordinator who was actually who works for one of the school districts. She was actually supposed to be our reviewer, decided to create a project too. So that made 7. And she did an 8th grade lesson plan. The high school lesson plans were reviewed by peer and staff and experts, and were determined that in the end, they just weren't ready to be published. So those 2 needed more work. So right now there are 1, 2, and also one of the elementary ones, I apologize. So there's only 1 elementary and there's 3 middle school lesson plans. So right now just 4. However, the elementary lesson plan has multiple days worth of material in it. So I think there's like 4 parts. So you could, in theory, consider that 4 lesson plans. My favorite, I think, have to be the 8th grade lesson plans. One in particular is called the Reverse Underground Railroad, or the Underground Railroad Turned Upside Down. And so I really love the way that the teacher kind of went at this information that discusses free African Americans and freedom seekers being kidnapped and sold back into enslavement. And he chose one of the primary sources that the intern scanned that none of the other teachers used. In fact, multiple of his primary sources in his lesson plan, none of the other teachers used. We had a lot of teachers using a lot of the same primary sources. So, but I think that would have to be my favorite. It's really interactive. He's just an amazing teacher. When it comes to like absolute quality, one of the 8th grade lesson plans was designed by someone who now works for the Department of Ed. So he's very, very talented in getting students to think critically about these primary sources. So that's an amazing lesson plan. I just really liked the kind of creative outside the box thinking. We do have other lesson plans on our website besides the Liberty and our Grasp lesson plans. And those actually, though, have not been created with, well, there might be some documents or images in the dams that we use for them, but not with the clear intent. So they had been things that we were working on over time. So a lesson plan for us is a long-term project. I can't just, spit these out in like days, just because of capacity.
Okay.
So I hope that answers your question.
Great. Next up, can you talk more about why you chose Islandora over the other dams? Did you consider any other dams? The answer is yes, we did go through a comparison process. Bill and Kristen, I'll invite you to jump in on that.
Yeah, I can start that out. We looked at a number of dams with the Force for Good team. For example, we looked at building a custom solution with them. We didn't want to do that because our staff probably wouldn't have been able to maintain it going forward. So we would need to hire at least 1 or 2 other tech people to take care of that. We also looked at DuraSpace and Alma and Content DM. And we also looked at Archivera itself, which is our archives catalog provided by Lucidia, because it does have a function there to attach digital images, but we found that that wouldn't really work as a dedicated digital library. There wasn't really enough space. And there are a couple other issues with that. So I can't remember all the differences between DuraSpace and Content DM and Alma and Islandora, but we did work through a sort of a solution evaluation matrix with Force for Good and landed on Islandora. And a lot of our time was then taken with choosing a vendor to provide Islandora. So I think Discovery Garden was sort of the middle of the road choice. One vendor we looked at, I think there wasn't quite as much flexibility as we wanted. And I think they couldn't tell us whether we would be starting out on Islandora 7 or Islandora 8. And there was quite a fundamental difference between Islandora 7 and Islandora 8. So we didn't want to start on 7 and then migrate to 8, which would have been a big process in itself. The third vendor that we looked at, we also had the problem where we would have need more staff tech resources to maintain it going forward. We didn't have that ready. So the Discovery Garden is great because the Islandora Discovery Garden project is great because it is a software as a solution. And it's really, at this point, us using it as a content management system to enter data and make what customizations we can. So yeah, in the end, we thought that was the best choice for us.
Mm-hmm. And I will say there were concerns about being such early adopters of Islandora 8, and knowing that so many of their other clients were still on 7. But I have to say now what we're hearing in conversation with other organizations who are having to make that migration is that we definitely made the right choice and not having to migrate twice in quick succession. So I'm sorry, Kristen, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I really, thanks, Lee. I just wanted to touch on the Force for Good component of this and really emphasizing how helpful it was to have an external resource that was helping us make this decision, and that we weren't making it 100% internally, although of course we made the final decision, but not Force for Good might not be available to everyone, but just really leaning into whatever kind of help you can get outside of the staff, somebody to help kind of guide that decision making, and a partner, or maybe our other programs similar to Force for Good, but that was particularly helpful in guiding that decision.
It was also helpful in making the case to our administration as well, having really proven that we had gone through a very careful selection process by using that selection matrix, and that we had the help of a third party making these decisions. So it really did lend a certain degree of gravitas to what we were bringing to our executive director and our board of trustees. So that was very helpful. Hope that answers your question. Next one, how did you explain the time and labor involved in this effort to other staff and admin? The answer to that one is we explained it often and intensively. One of the other things that I will say was helpful in this process, particularly after Bill had developed the workflow, was in bringing a few of our staff into that workflow for them to try it out for themselves and get a real sense of the steps involved, how many, how much, the FAGI standards that we were adhering to, and all of those kinds of things, that this is not just a case of slapping something on a scanner and spitting it out in digital form. There is a lot that goes into metadata creation and making this information usable and preserve it in the long term. So it's a constant sort of state of education for existing staff and new staff as they come in, knowing that they need what they need and they need it on a certain timeline, but that in order for to create effective digital assets that are preserved in the long term, there is a process, and it's not necessarily a quick one. So hope that helps.
Lee, do you mind if I jump in really quickly?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, from the education standpoint, I just want to say that we didn't really have a choice. So this was actually, Liberty in Our Grasp was grasped wholeheartedly by administration. As I mentioned, he kind of jumped the gun and presented it before we were even able to let Bill and Lee in on it. But the other aspect of this was House Bill 198, and add in the pandemic. We were closed. We were shut down for I think 18 months. And so people were not coming into library to use our resources. We didn't have the dams at that time. Who was our built-in audience at that time? Education, teachers. Teachers needed those resources. And it wasn't like because we were doing these two things, we had to give up everything else. We were still doing all the other things that we needed to do to get through that time period. So it wasn't really a matter of having to explain it. It was a matter of just doing it, unfortunately.
Yeah,
So.
Going forward, though, it's definitely been a case of not explaining the workflow in all of its glory, but at least giving people some level of understanding as to what goes into this process. And it is extensive and intensive. Last question we have here right now: what methods do you use to prioritize the collections you upload? Is there a kind of triage? I'm going to invite everybody to jump in on that. That is definitely the prioritization of our digitization is something that we are working on. So that's kind of the next phase in our goals. But for right now, we do sort of work in conversation with one another, try and find out what projects are going on, particularly for Rebecca in our Mitchell Center. We also look at what collections may be partially digitized to see what low-hanging fruit is out there. For instance, when we did digitize much of the slavery collection for Liberty in Our Grasp, we weren't able to digitize everything. That project was on a very tight timeline. So we have been able to go back again with the help of other interns and staff and really complete digitizing that collection. And there are others that fall into a similar category, but Bill or Rebecca, I'd invite you to kind of comment on that as well.
Yeah, I was just we still scan by request from the
Yes.
public and staff. We don't have something digitized. And we try to prioritize projects from education that'll really reach our audiences. On top of that, we sort of have a best practice selection and prioritization document that we use loosely, that talks about things like use or projected use, research value, whether something has been digitized and made available at another institution at an acceptable quality. So we use that when we are thinking about new collections that we want to add to digital collections. For other collections, we sort of already know that they're requested often by the public in our reading room and through other requests. And I'd say the Liberty in Our Grasp and other projects were interesting as far as selection goes because you have to look at best practice and then decide what's best for a specific audience. So for example, we're working with Delaware teachers and maybe we have something that is available somewhere else at the right quality, and we can point them to that, provide a link to that for them. But maybe because it's a Delaware organization or Delaware teachers, we want to have that in our dams at the Delaware Historical Society, so it's available to them because we are a Delaware institution serving Delaware.
So a lot goes into it, and we're going to continue to refine that process going forward. And as I said, bringing the right people to the table to help make those decisions so that it's not happening in a vacuum is really important across the organization. I don't see any additional questions at this time, although if you have any, we're very happy to answer them. And I know we've just about hit our time limit, but again, I just want to thank everybody on behalf of my colleagues. It's been a great conversation and we appreciate your questions. Please do feel free to contact any of us. I've got our email addresses up on the slide here, and we're always happy to talk about all things dams and digital projects. So thank you all again very much. Thank you again to Lucidia for sponsoring this session, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.